Welcome to a quick voiceover PowerPoint covering some of the information that you just read for this week's module. I'm also going to review the various L2 errors that students make, which recaps information that we did a couple weeks ago. The topic in general is L2 errors and what to do with them. So this is an overview of L2 errors, the top three: L1 interference, developmental sequencing, and language learning environment. And this is something you actually read about a couple weeks ago when we first introduced L2 errors. So let's start with L1 interference. Well, behaviorists believe that an individual's first language is actually going to interfere with their ability to learn their second language. Therefore, using the L1 during the language learning process should be avoided. However, nativists believe that L1, so your first language competency or first language competence, is actually beneficial in acquiring your second language, and it helps bridge the gap, that learning gap. So the question is, who is right? Well, nativists would say that after everyone has acquired their first language, so everyone has a first language, right? That you've kind of embedded basic rules and form from that language that basically is going to help you in figuring out the structure, rules, and form of a second language, therefore help you in acquiring that second language. So every language in the world has nouns and verbs. Every language has the ability to express future tense and past tense. So essentially having L1 competence, knowledge of language based on the fact you have a first language, is going to help you in your L2 because you're going to be able to pull up that internal grammar to make sense of the second language. And of course, there are a lot of positive things that can happen when your first language helps guide you in your acquisition of the second language. So we call this positive transfer when something from a feature from your L1, so your first language, is able to assist you with a similar feature that exists in the second language. So that could be a sound system, right? Maybe we know that in English and Spanish that all five vowel sounds in Spanish exist in English. So there are 5 vowels in the English. English has 14 vowels. We know that 5 of those exist in Spanish. So I know when I go to attempt speaking Spanish, if I pull from those 5 vowel sounds I already know that exist in Spanish, I might not struggle with the vowel system in Spanish, and vice versa. We also have these things called cognates, which are essentially when one word in one language is nearly or exactly identical to an existing word in the target language. So the meaning is the same. The pronunciation is either identical or roughly the same. And when you're able to pull from that L1 language experience and have success in that second language, this is known as positive transfer. But of course, there also exists the concept of negative transfer, which is when something from your first language cannot apply to the second language, but you may still try to apply it either way. So, for example, in Spanish, the letter A gets the ah sound as in father, right? However, in English, the letter A might get ah as in father, or a as in cat, or in some instances it gets the schwa sound. So a Spanish speaker working with the English alphabet would have negative transfer by over applying the ah for father with every instance of the letter A in English. So we also have false cognates. So we just talked about positive cognates, where words that are seemingly identical in both languages actually have the same meaning and a close to near consistent pronunciation with each other. But we also, with false cognates, there are words that exist in Spanish, for example, that might look like an identical word in English, but the pronunciation, while maybe similar, the meaning of the two words is drastically different. So just because we want to assume that exit and éxito are the same word, they're not. They actually have very different meaning. Luckily, there are not as many false cognates as there are true cognates between the two languages. So interference can produce negative transfer. So another way to say negative transfer is to say L1 interference. And it can produce a lot of errors in the second language. It's all based on this idea that when you learn a language, you first think of the whole idea or thought in your native language in your head, and you translate it directly in your head, and then you try to speak what you just translated. Now, that may happen, especially with beginning language learners, but intermediate and advanced learners do not tend to use that strategy. So, behaviorists thought that every single error came from one's L1, from one's first language. And that's not true. It's about 40 to 50% of the errors come from interference from your native language. And that's still quite a bit. It's just that this is not the only explanation anymore. There are other explanations for this. And one of them is developmental sequencing. Now, this is kind of the opposite of what we were just talking about. This has nothing to do with your L1. These are things that everybody has challenges with. Everybody struggles with these things when they learn English, no matter what their first language is. So in English, folks really tend to struggle with subject-verb agreement. And it seems like a simple rule, but it really causes problems for language learners. So in addition to subject-verb agreement, question formation, we've looked at some of that this semester, formation, negation, irregular verbs, irregular nouns, these are going to be tricky for every English language learner. And these mistakes are not derived from the L1. And we call these items developmental sequences because you have to progress through certain stages in order to improve on them. And your L1, so your first language, is not going to help you or hurt you in acquiring these features of English. It literally is just this sequence and building block, basically scaffolding from the basic unit of subject verb agreement to more complex ones, or basic understanding of nouns to identifying regular versus irregular. It's all a scaffolding process. So there's a concept that may have been mentioned a little bit this semester, but not too much. It's the concept of interlanguage. And this is when you start developing your own way of speaking the L2. It's not necessarily how native speakers would use the language, but it's certainly not you translating everything from your first language to the second language. And as a result, you develop your own way of speaking and you use it consistently. And we could probably say that it's your own internal grammar at this point as you progress through the stages. Some people rely on their interlanguage and it kind of fossilizes or freezes. They plateau. They know enough to get by and they don't really feel the need to try different registers or different styles of that language. So we call this fossilization. It's when your interlanguage has stopped progressing or has stopped taking on new forms of the target language. So the last category is language learning environment. And what we know is that some of the errors speakers make can be attributed to that L1 interference. Some of them can be attributed to developmental sequencing, but there's about 20% of errors that are not explained by either of those. So let's say there are a group of students in Japan. So they are Japanese students learning English, but they are learning it while they are in Japan. And they are learning about English idioms, so common English phrases. And let's say they're learning about the idiom, it's raining cats and dogs, but they mistakenly learn it's raining dogs and cats. And that sounds a little weird, right? Because it's a misspeak of the idiom. So in looking at this type of error, we know it's not L1 interference. It's not that something from Japanese. They don't have a phrase over there for, I don't think they do, but I don't think they have a phrase for it's raining cats and dogs in which say it's raining dogs and cats. So we don't think that it's a Japanese error influencing their acquisition of English. It's also not a sequencing error because these are idioms. So it's not like you progress from learning smaller forms of idioms to larger forms of idioms. All idioms have meaning on their own and it's not a sequence in order to acquire them. So there's a third type of error going on here, and that's the language learning environment. So again, the key was these are English language learners who are Japanese learning English in Japan, so that access to the authentic use of the idiom is not available for them. So that was a quick review of the three L2 errors, the explanations for L2 errors, or the sources of L2 errors. But now I want to roll into what your reading was about this week. And I think the information is quite practical because when you're a language teacher and you have 30 plus students in your classroom and they're all struggling with the language for different reasons, of course you naturally want to address those errors. And the question is, what is the best method to handle speech errors or other type of errors in the classroom? And I've divided this into three categories. So there's when the teacher supplies the correct answer. There's when the student supplies the correct answer or is encouraged to generate the correct answer. And then there's when there's no correct answer supplied. So let's start with teacher supplies correct answer by visiting explicit correction. So explicit correction is probably exactly what you're thinking. It's when the teacher, you, the instructor, provides the correction to the student and not only corrects them and provides the corrected version, but you're also providing the grammatical reasoning behind why that is the correct version. When you provide that grammatical reasoning or that grammatical support, we call this metalinguistic feedback. So metalinguistic means when you're using linguistic terms to talk about language. So you're giving that mini grammar lesson. So let's say you had a student say, they were running by the blue big car. And as the instructor, you would respond with something like, they were running by the big blue car. The adjective comes before the noun it is describing. So you can see how this type of correction or addressing the error can really slow down the moment, which can be a good thing. But unless the lesson you're leading is on adjectives and nouns, then stopping to describe the error might actually be a little bit confusing. So let's say this was a quick exercise you're doing with 40 students in your class. To stop and go into this explicit metalinguistic feedback might actually kind of hinder some of that progression. The student might not know, okay, should I keep reading about the big blue car, or do you want me to stop and discuss now adjectives and nouns? So here's another example. Your student says, everybody waved at President on the street. And as the instructor, with your explicit correction, you would say, there is only one president in the US, and therefore we use the because he is the only one, the president. Okay, so very explicit, right? And some of you are probably familiar with this because your teachers and I myself will quickly jump into explicit correction, hoping you're getting it. But on the spectrum of implicit correction versus explicit, these two examples are very much heavy on the explicit side. The other technique in this category would be recast, and these are actually quite common. This is simply when the teacher restates what the student has said, but with the correct grammar applied and not with that metalinguistic grammar lesson information. So an example would be a student saying, my father took the equipments to the house of his boss. And the teacher might respond with, oh, so your father took the equipment to his boss's house. So the teacher has communicated to the student that he or she understood what the student was saying, but basically recast the sentence, recast the phrase to the student, modeling the correct use of the language while also ironing out the errors, basically. So another example, the student says, my sister's birthday, she has it on March. So the teacher would say, oh, your sister's birthday is in March. So again, another example where the teacher is modeling or recasting what the correction should be. The teacher is not asking or prompting the student to correct their own speech. The teacher supplies the correct answer. So again, this is why recast and explicit correction are under teacher supplying the correct answer, and it's not an example of this teacher eliciting the correct answer from the student. The teacher is modeling it. So speaking of eliciting the answer from the student, this goes into our student supplies correct answer with our first item up being elicitation. So this is when the teacher is going to help isolate the error or basically set up the situation so the student is able to understand what they got wrong, but not supplying the answer or the correction to the student, having them develop that arrival on their own. So an example, the student might say, Well, she borrowed many pen before. The teacher would say, she borrowed many, and the student would luckily arrive at pens. But with what the teacher's doing here is she's setting this, he or she is setting the student up to realize that there has been an error, and the student is prompted to identify that the error must have been with the word pen. So she borrowed many, and the student thinks, oh, well, pen was the next word. And now the student might not know that this is an issue of plurality. So pen versus pens. The student might think, oh, I pronounced the word wrong, right? So now they want to overcorrect their pronunciation of the word. Either way, though, the success is that it brings awareness to where the error exists in the sentence or in the utterance, and it allows the student to take another pass at that and decide what they think the error is, and given the opportunity to correct it. So again, you isolate the error and you set it up to give the student a chance to identify what went wrong. So another quick example, the student says, Carlos cutted the cake right away. The teacher says, Carlos what the cake? The student says, cutted, cut. Yes, cut. He cut the cake. So again, another example of the educator eliciting the correction from the student. So in an elicitation, the educator is really narrowing it down for the student where the error likely exists or where the error exists. Clarification requests, on the other hand, the teacher kind of leaves it more broad and open on where the error might be. So not only is the educator possibly hinting at the student improving a grammatical aspect of their utterance, but possibly in addition, a pragmatic challenge, or if not a grammatical aspect at all, just a pragmatic level challenge. So again, like elicitation, the student, though, is given the opportunity to rephrase or correct what was said. So an example would be the student saying, I sometimes don't like my brother. It is always shouting at me. The teacher says, I'm not sure I know what you mean. Tell me again why you don't like your brother. The student says, oh, he is shouting. So the student doesn't know that the issue is necessarily a pronoun issue. In elicitation, the teacher might respond with saying, it is always shouting at me, right? And really identifying that with stress that the word it has an error. However, here the educator leaves it a little more open-ended for the student to interpret where the error is. So tell me again why you don't like your brother. And the student corrects, oh, he is shouting. Now, this method, clarification requests, are probably more successful and more useful with intermediate to advanced students, where elicitation is going to be a lot more helpful with beginner level. So another example, the teacher says, what did you eat yesterday? The student says, I eat a big salad. Teacher says, yesterday? Student says, yeah. What was going on yesterday? I ate a big salad. So again, unlike elicited feedback, the teacher's not drawing immediate attention to the verb being the error. Had it been elicitation, the teacher might have said, you eat a big salad yesterday, trying to emphasize where the error was. However, this is left a little more vague. The educator emphasizes the word yesterday, so hinting at this is a past tense issue, but basically having the student make a couple cognitive jumps to arrive at what the teacher is getting at. You're encouraging students to examine what they say and figure it out themselves. I think it's difficult to know whether or not your students can handle vague clarification requests like this, but it gives you a good sense of the skill level your student is at when you give them the opportunity to work with this type of students supplied correction. This last category we're going to call repetition, but it's a little more complicated than that, but I'm going to give you a couple examples and then we'll discuss more about it. So here the teacher is going to repeat exactly what the student says with the error, and hopefully the student notices it. It's a similar approach as elicitation, but here I think it's even more permissive because it allows for errors to happen. So a student might say, it was happened last night. The teacher says, it was happened last night. Yes, it happened last night. They called my parents and blamed me for it. That's terrible. So notice here the teacher repeats exactly what the student has said, and in the recast, the student has corrected themselves in this instant, but it wasn't necessarily with the teacher prompting or emphasizing that an error was made. It's very subtle and it doesn't interrupt the flow of the conversation. I'm also going to put the word compliance on there because many times in this category they'll talk about the word compliance. Compliance is simply ignoring the language error altogether. So on a scale of explicit correction and implicit correction, this would be extremely on the side of implicit correction. So the approach, the communicative language teaching style, doesn't believe in correcting errors, and this is what it would look like. So in the exchange where the student says, well, she borrowed many pen before. Did she give them back to you? Yes, except one time she did not. Well, maybe she forgot. So notice here the teacher does not address the errors at all. She ignores all the errors and continues with the conversation. So here the student is having an authentic communication with the teacher, an authentic conversation, and the teacher wants to respect that by not bogging the student down with correcting the errors, but more so foster the conversation by asking logical additional questions. So another example, the student says, Carlos cutted the cake right away. So he didn't even wait for the birthday girl to blow out the candles? No, she didn't blow the candles yet. Wow, I've never seen that before. So again, we see that same conversational support where the teacher is validating the conversation with the student. There's no correction, which in turn slows down the turn taking in the conversation. And it shows that the teacher is engaged in the student and engaged in the story. So we call this compliance, and it's basically ignoring all the errors. And now you may be wondering, well, how is that going to help the student? So the argument here is that this student in this example uses cutted, right? An irregular verb. He puts the ed at the end. And that he's just not at an advanced enough level to notice that he's making that error. But once he progresses to an intermediate or an advanced level and he starts noticing that native speakers don't produce the word this way, that he will be able to self-correct at that time. So this is very different than the behaviorist perspective, which would argue that practicing these bad habits is going to lead to negative or bad habit formation. Here, the nativist would argue that it's not really a bad habit, it's just they're not at the proficiency level yet to notice the error. So there is this whole hypothesis called the noticing hypothesis. And you can see that based on what we just reviewed, they each have different ideas on how we get the students to notice the mistakes. The last one we just reviewed, which was compliance, says, well, no, you can point the error out to the student, but they're not at the level or advanced level of speaking yet to notice that type of error and therefore deal with it or correct it yet. And yet there are other theories that argue the student needs to be told about the error, be told what the correction is, that they need to notice the error before the language learning can happen. So this totally contradicts Krashen's distinction between acquisition and learning. So he's more all about the learning through the unconscious state, so the same way we learned our first language, and that people would notice it once they are more advanced. But of course, there's a lot of research out there indicating that if a student is not drawn, if their attention's not drawn to the mistake and corrected, that they're not going to be able to break the habit or use the corrected version moving forward. We didn't talk a lot about uptake, but essentially this is once you give feedback to a student, it's good to take note of what kind of response they give you to that feedback. Does your corrective feedback shut down the student? Does it make them more timid? Does it make them not want to take risks with the language anymore? Or does your response to their errors encourage them to engage with you, to respond to you in a way that shows that they are understanding and applying what you are telling them? Okay, that is a summary of the reading that was assigned for this module. Please send me any questions you guys might have, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you. Bye.